What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so never in a million years would I have believed we'd have a reason to make a video about Valkyrie. I had no reason ever to believe that she would actually get any measure of screen time, but I'm glad she is, because Valkyrie is really one of the more interesting characters in Marvel. She can be really confusing, but she's really intriguing in terms of her role in the Marvel pantheon and how she exists and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the Valkyrie concept, there is a lot of confusion among people who are not familiar with her character, in the sense that there's the Valkyrie as a idea, as a concept of sorts, and then there's the Valkyrie character. The first appearance of Valkyrie, quote unquote, was the concept. It actually came out in Avengers number 83 back in 1970, I think it was, and it was written by Roy Thomas. Now remember, with Roy Thomas writing the Avengers between issues 35 and 104, I believe, it was all about experimentation. It was all about trying new things, seeing what worked. In a lot of ways, his experimentation with the Avengers set the stage for Chris Claremont's experimentation with the X-Men. But regardless, the whole idea was that Valkyrie's debut basically came with the actions of a character called Amora The Enchantress. Now, we didn't initially know about this. Instead, the Valkyrie character just kind of popped up in really more of a two-part story with issues 82 and 83. The bulk of it was in 83, but it was basically a two-part story that featured the introduction and the creation of a concept called the Lady Liberators. Now, the Lady Liberators was Roy Thomas's attempt to roll in female readers, in the sense that the Valkyrie persona as it showed up was basically like, all men everywhere are bad, they're chauvinists, and they have to go away. It was interesting in terms of how it happened, but when it came to comic books back in the 1950s, 1960s, even going all the way back to like the 30s and 40s, there was really just like two separate markets. You basically had like the romance market, you know, young stories about people being in love and things like that. That's where a lot of the girls resided. And then you had superheroes, and that's where a lot of the boys resided. And the result was that when the superhero genre really began to experience this second renaissance from the mid-1950s with the introduction of Barry Allen and Marvel's explosion of popularity in the early 1960s, the idea was to grab those female readers who never would have really had a reason to read superhero comics and bring them in. And the Lady Liberators served that purpose, because it was essentially this Valkyrie character bringing together Janet Van Dyne, the wife of Hank Pym, the Scarlet Witch, Medusa of the Inhumans, and Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow. The problem with this is that if you didn't read Marvel, you didn't really know who these characters were. And so the introduction in and of itself alienated a lot of potential female readers, because they picked up the story and felt totally lost because it was assumed they already knew who these characters were. And so the story as it unfolds is it basically deals with this idea of Valkyrie giving her origin, in the sense that she was basically a lab assistant for a person named Dr. Irwin, and Dr. Irwin was depicted as this guy who was extremely chauvinist, basically saying, I don't need a woman to help me. You know, if I need a secretary, I'll get a hold of you. But until then, just get out of here and go do your thing. Following this, it unfolded much in the same way as like Jay Garrick the Flash's origin. The Flash Jay Garrick was a kid who was basically working with deuterium, with heavy water. You know, in this instance, it is this woman, you know, Valkyrie, working with chemicals. She's trying to figure out what's going on. Eventually, she just passes out from exhaustion. Jay Garrick passed out from exhaustion. They end up waking up after being exposed to these fumes. Jay Garrick can run at the speed of thought, and Valkyrie has powers. Their origin stories are almost completely identical. But regardless, the scenario basically unfolded with Valkyrie realizing she had these abilities, and in turn came to the belief that men everywhere were bad. What it did is it led to her rallying up these various female leads from the existing Marvel superhero stories, and then taking them to basically battle the Avengers. Now, the arrival of the Avengers is kind of interesting. It's basically a costume contest that's going on in Rutland, Vermont, which is kind of funny here. But the Avengers showing up is just the idea that they were basically lured here under false pretenses. It eventually leads to them taking part in a parade, you know, for Halloween and so on and so forth. But they're also met with the Masters of Evil, because, you know, they're the Masters of Evil, whatever. And so ultimately, things unfold with this bit of a skirmish between the Avengers, the Masters of Evil. Then the Lady Liberators arrive. And this basically results in a explanation of sorts. It results in the truth coming to light, in the sense that the Lady Liberators, led by Valkyrie, are actually able to overpower their, you know, the other superheroes who were there. And then in turn, we end up finding out that what the Masters of Evil were after was a device that had been constructed by Dr. Edwin. It was essentially this device that was referred to as the parallel time projector. And what it would do is it would allow a person to access alternate realities. And so this was ultimately what the Lady Liberators, led by Valkyrie, were pursuing. Not only that, we actually end up finding out that this is not Valkyrie. Instead, this is a person called Amora the Enchantress, and this is where the confusion of the origin story begins to come into play. With regards to Amora the Enchantress, she was actually some girl who was just born in Asgard somewhere, and then eventually was trained under the Norns, who were basically these super powerful witches of sorts that exist in Asgard proper. Ultimately, it led to Amora being booted just because of the fact that she just refused to accept any measure of discipline, and then from there, she just charmed various people who were adept in sorcery and magic and so on and so forth, using her abilities to effectively enslave guys, and then in turn, bolster her own powers. And so from there was a point whereby she was kicked out of Asgard alongside Executioner, which is one of the characters that you're going to see in Thor Ragnarok, and alongside Enchantress, he helped her alongside a multitude of her campaigns. But because of the fact that she was literally trying to seize Asgard from Odin, she was booted out. This led to them being banished to a different realm, and then eventually Executioner left her and went to another queen, and then that goes into the origin story of the Defenders. So keep that in the back of your mind for a second. But the whole idea here is that because of the fact that Enchantress is just this chick who was essentially heartbroken by the fact that, Executioner left her hanging and was able to defy her senses, means that she's now just on this quest to seize control of Asgard and just sort of rule everything. And of course, once everybody realizes what's going on, Tasha Romanoff and Black Widow, Janet Van Dyne and Scarlet Witch, they basically overpower her and she's just sent to another dimension, and that's really about it. Now, the whole idea of the Valkyrie character, which is to say the topic of this particular video, this really came out of several prelude stories. With Roy Thomas writing the Avengers, the goal of Marvel was to basically bolster their comics in any conceivable way that they possibly could. I mean, if they could spin off new X-Men titles, they would spin off new X-Men titles. If they could spin off more Spider-Man titles, they would spin off more Spider-Man titles. It was the idea, make as many comics as we can conceivably get away with without breaking our budget, and then see if they sell. If they don't sell, we'll cancel them. But you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, so we might as well just throw them out there anyway. And so what ended up happening is in the respective series of Namor the Submariner, Doctor Strange, and the Incredible Hulk, it was basically laying the groundwork for the creation of the Defenders. And the Defenders, not to sound crass, were basically a poor man's Avengers. That's really all they were. It was just kind of a small-time spin-off version of the Avengers, but it was a superhero team unto itself in the sense that instead of focusing on planetary threats or like invasions by Loki or different things like that, Doctor Strange's Defenders team would face off against mystical threats. And it was actually pretty cool in terms of how it came together. But the fact remains, when it came to the Defenders comic itself, really it was a story that began in the solo series of Namor the Incredible Hulk and what was left of Doctor Strange, and finished out in issues 1 through 3 of Defenders, followed by issue number 4 seeing the actual introduction of Valkyrie. Now, this also saw the introduction of a character named Barbara Norse, who in a lot of ways was the Donald Blake of the Thor personality, and we'll talk about those comparisons here in a second. But Barbara Norse was a character who was introduced when Steve Englehart initially launched the Defenders line, owing to the fact that writer Roy Thomas had been promoted to editor-in-chief. And the idea was that Barbara Norse was basically just part of a cult that belonged to a group called the Undying Ones, these sort of race of monster-like creatures who had inhabited the Earth at one point, ruled the planet, and then ultimately escaped to another dimension during the War of the Elder Gods and different things like that. But the overall gist of this was that Barbara Norse, alongside her husband Jack Norse, had sought to see the return of the Undying Ones. Now, in the individual stories, really the Incredible Hulk 125 and 126, this expanded on the idea that Barbara Norse had effectively been tricked into joining this cult by her mom. But the fact remains here that with this particular character, she was this person who effectively turncoated, in the sense that once she realized how bad an invasion of the Undying Ones would be, how much it would destroy all things in existence, she ultimately turned against the Undying Ones and tried to keep them confined. This coincided with the official launch of the Defenders and the arrival of Namor the Submariner, the Incredible Hulk, and Doctor Strange. And so in this instance, it basically led to this wholesale defeat of the Undying Ones, but someone had to remain behind and be this sort of gatekeeper that would ensure they couldn't escape their dimension, which Barbara Norse volunteered to do. The problem is that by the time issue number 3 came about and it led to the Defenders returning to try to rescue Barbara Norse and effectively allow Doctor Strange to use his magic to keep the Undying Ones banished to their realm forever, we ended up finding out some pretty seedy things happened behind the scenes, in the sense that Barbara Norse was basically forced to mate with the Nameless One, the leader of the Undying Ones. The result was that it led to her effectively losing her mind. Now, this led directly into issue number 4 and the intention of Steve Englehart introducing the idea of the Valkyrie concept. And what we ended up learning is that in addition to the Defenders off doing their own thing, in the background, we also had Amora the Enchantress, who had already escaped following the events of Avengers number 83, coming back in several instances and continuing her campaign to seize control of Asgard. This led her to come across a character named Black Knight, who really isn't relevant. I mean, he's an Avenger, but he's not that popular. Marvel tried to bring him back during All New, All Different Marvel, and it didn't work. Nobody read about his comic. Most people didn't even know he was there. But the whole idea was that with the character of Black Knight alongside Amora the Enchantress, they had basically come across and been whisked away to the realm of a woman named Cassiolena. Now, Cassiolena just harbored this vendetta against Amora the Enchantress because, you know, she was accidentally misidentified as Amora and then banished from Asgard. So it was just, hey, you got me kicked out of Asgard and now I hate you. That's basically what it is. This led into, you know, essentially Amora being captured, the fact that her magic was effectively suppressed by Cassiolena, and ultimately with the arrival of Barbara Norris here alongside the Defenders, it offered the opportunity for Amora to make her escape. Now, in truth, there were a litany of ways that Amora possibly could have gotten out here. She could have just waited for the Defenders to engineer their own escape, but Steve Englehart wanted to introduce the concept of Valkyrie because of the fact that the letters pages, which is to say the letters that fans write into Marvel Comics, were so overwhelmingly supportive of a Valkyrie character that Marvel almost seemed forced to introduce the idea into comics. And so in this instance, what Amora the Enchantress does is actually use her powers to basically bond Barbara Norris with the personality of Brynhildr. Now, initially this was not known. Instead, Brynhildr didn't actually exist as a concept at this time. Instead, it was just Barbara Norris becoming the character of Valkyrie, and then basically being given all the powers of Thor, minus the hammer that he wields and like control over lightning. And so because of that, in this particular circumstance, Valkyrie helps to engineer the escape of the Defenders. Amora the Enchantress makes her escape. She turns Black Knight to stone, which nobody cared about. And then ultimately the stories kind of continued on. Now, going into the future of the Defenders line of comics in Marvel Comics, especially when it comes to, you know, the character of Valkyrie, Steve Englehart only ever really wrote like a handful of issues. He wrote issues 1 through 11, basically. On the Avengers side, he wrote issues 105 through 135. And so we saw some cool crossovers like the Avengers Defenders War, but for the most part, the evolution of the character of Valkyrie was almost non-existent outside of the fact that she was just a really cool member of the team. And, you know, Englehart gave us displays of what she was capable of. But with Englehart leaving and traveling over to DC, just kind of giving up the idea of writing 2 titles at one time, we ended up seeing, you know, the titles taken over by like Len Wein and Steve Gerber, who was basically ousted in 1978 after he tried to sue Marvel for Howard the Duck. We ended up seeing things like Jerry Conway taking over the title. In all honesty, the character of Valkyrie just was a character on the team. That was really about it. It wasn't until the publication was taken over by David Anthony Kraft with issue number 58 in 1978 that we began to see this sort of wholesale reformation of the Valkyrie concept and taking this character who had just kind of been created by Amora the Enchantress and actually creating roots and creating an alternate personality and finally establishing this sort of, you know, Thor Donald Blake dichotomy with regards to the Brynhildr Barbara Norris personality. Beginning with issue number 58 and running all the way up to issue number 68, what David Anthony Kraft, or really David Kraft, started doing was crafting this sort of epic in the sense that between issues 58 and 65, Valkyrie would start to get these weird visions where she would basically get these sort of flashbacks, quote unquote, to a life that she doesn't recall. As a result, what David Anthony Kraft started doing was basically revealing the idea that Valkyrie was part of a group called the Valkyrie. And what the Valkyrie did is they were basically responsible for rescuing the dead who basically worshipped Asgardians from the battlefield and taking them directly to Valhalla. Valkyrie herself was the leader of the Valkyrie. She was the leader of this group. Now, this revelation came to a head in issues 66 through 68 in a story titled Val and Valhalla, and it was basically just this idea that Brynhildr was the actual Valkyrie, and Brynhildr existed in the same body alongside Barbara Norris, and it allowed for this sort of Donald Blake Thor dichotomy to exist for the character of Valkyrie herself. But for quite some time, nothing was ever really done about that. Things largely just sort of remained the same as they always had, with the added bonus that Valkyrie might cross over with Thor, that she would appear in other titles outside of the Defenders, but again, that was really about it. However, in 1981, with issue number 92, running all the way through to 1984 with issue number 118, writer J.M.D. Mateus had taken over the Defenders line. And if the blog of Jim Shooter is to be believed, because he was editor-in-chief, by editorial decree, Jim Shooter wanted to bring Valkyrie closer in line with the Thor mythos by just making her the character she was supposed to be. And so, in Defenders issue number 109, in a story called Cry the Valkyrie, Barbara Norris's body was effectively killed. And what this did is it allowed Marvel to go forward and basically take the character of Brynhildr, the actual Valkyrie, and give her her original body back. And so going forward into Marvel Comics following the Cry the Valkyrie story, Brynhildr and Valkyrie were the same person. It was basically her own body. It was tantamount to casting off the Donald Blake personality, and all you had was Thor. This coincided with Thor issue number 337 about a year and a half later when Walt Simonson took over the Thor title, and it allowed Marvel to cross the characters over even more due to the fact that the Thor mythos was being expanded more than ever before by Walt Simonson himself. The downside to this was that because Walt Simonson's run on Thor was so well received, interest in Valkyrie effectively plummeted. In the eyes of a lot of people who were reading the Thor comics, they effectively viewed Valkyrie as like a poor man's Thor. She was just a female ripoff of Thor. And so because of that, with the Defenders title already ailing due to the fact that Silver Surfer and Doctor Strange and the Incredible Hulk, they had effectively taken off, and they were replaced by characters like Andromeda and Manslaughter and Candy Southern and Interloper, what it meant was that the Defenders line essentially just flopped. And so in February of 1986, with issue number 152, Jim Shooter ordered the title to be canceled. And so what happened was writer Peter B. Gillis basically followed up these last vestiges of the plot threads in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme issues 3 and 4 by basically saying that in this final battle with the Defenders and, this massive dragon, this dragon of the moon as it was called, that Valkyrie, her physical form, had basically died. And instead what she had done is her essence had gone back to Asgard, been reconstituted, and then she went back to being her role as the leader of the Valkyrie, which is to say taking the spirits of those who worshipped Asgardians who died on the field of battle and taking them to Valhalla. And she basically remained that way for over 20 years. Between 1986 and 2004, Valkyrie was gone from the Marvel landscape. She had disappeared in her entirety. And even then, back in 2004, the only real indication we saw of her existence was the fact that she was one of the Asgardians who had effectively died during the events of Ragnarok when Loki had marched on Asgard and basically brought it crumbling down to the ground. Now, going into the post-Ragnarok run of J. Michael Straczynski and the Return of the Asgardians, for most fans of Valkyrie, it was believed that this is where she would make her return, but instead she didn't. Her character didn't actually pop up until the Ed Brubaker written series, Secret Avengers. And the whole idea was that this basically came out of Dark Reign. This was essentially a set of events where the Secret Invasion storyline basically led to the idea that the Skrulls were replacing humans and superheroes. Tony Stark was ousted as S.H.I.E.L.D. due to his failure to realize this was happening. Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, was put in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D. He immediately dissolved S.H.I.E.L.D., formed Hammer, got rid of the Superhuman Registration Act from Civil War I, and then in turn was effectively defeated and removed from the equation. But during the time in which he was running Hammer, where he was basically running the show, while his schemes were pretty sinister in the sense that he was intending to use his power to plot world domination, he had tasked Captain America Steve Rogers with carrying out his own goals or carrying out his own actions. In response to this, Steve Rogers formed a team called the Secret Avengers, and then Valkyrie was just there. She was just suddenly part of the team. There wasn't a whole lot of explanation in terms of how she got there. It was just she was one of the Asgardians who was resurrected after the events of Ragnarok, and that was really about it. But for most fans of Valkyrie, they didn't really care how it was that she was there, just so long as she was there. The downside to this was that there wasn't really a whole lot done with her character. There was some to a degree, but it was really an attempt by Marvel through various writers and storylines, the revamped Fearless Defenders, the idea of her playing a role in fear itself and getting the hammers of those who were chosen to be worthy by the serpent, basically the secret brother of Odin. For the most part, it was those little stories here and there that were designed to tap back into the old Steve Gerber, Steve Englehart, JMD Mateus, David Kraft run on the Avengers and the development of Valkyrie, but ultimately it didn't really work. And so what ended up happening is in the last little tidbits of the Fearless Defenders run, one of the things that Marvel did was introduce a character by the name of Annabelle Riggs. And Annabelle Riggs was basically this archaeologist that was a huge fan of, old artifacts, things like that. But the idea here was to take the character of Valkyrie and to merge her with Annabelle Riggs, sort of bringing back this old Brynhildr and Barbara Norse concept. And so what ended up happening is during the final tidbits of this story, Annabelle Riggs was effectively killed. Brynhildr traveled to the afterlife alongside the assistant of sorts of Doctor Strange, Clea, and in turn had Annabelle Riggs resurrected, but at the cost that Valkyrie's spirit would be bonded to Annabelle Riggs for all time. And so it was basically this idea that Valkyrie would be stuck to the character. The problem is that this happened anywhere around 2014, I think, 2013, 2014. And so this effectively dead-ended into Marvel's start of the collapse of the multiverse, the Avengers and New Avengers written by Jonathan Hickman, and the Secret Wars event in 2015. And so whatever intentions Marvel had with the character of Valkyrie were effectively shelved in place of the collapse of the multiverse and the launch of All New, All Different Marvel. Now, as far as I'm aware, Valkyrie has not appeared in All New, All Different Marvel. We don't know where she is. We don't even know if she exists anymore. Most likely, she was just forgotten by Marvel editorial. Regardless of the scenario, Valkyrie is not there. Now, most likely in response to the Thor Ragnarok film, Valkyrie will make a return and will most likely see this sort of second iteration of the Lady Liberators, essentially an all-female superhero team. But regardless, hopefully this video will help you guys understand about the character of Valkyrie. She's a little wild, she's a little crazy, her history's a little muddled, but the fact remains here. Basically imagine a female version of Thor who's less powerful. I mean, honestly, the Valkyrie concept has been replaced by Jane Foster for the most part. I mean, well, Jane Foster is Thor. most likely, you know, if Marvel makes the mistake, which I think they're gonna make, they're probably just gonna turn Jane Foster into Valkyrie, which I really hope they don't do. She's an amazing Thor. Regardless of how that plays out, Valkyrie may or may not return. I have no earthly clue in terms of what'll happen. But, well, the current story in Marvel Legacy is the death of the mighty Thor, but it doesn't mean that Jane Foster will actually die. It probably just means that, like, Odin's son will get his hammer back, and then they'll probably turn her into Valkyrie. Now that I think about it, God, that'd be so disappointing, because, like, nobody likes Valkyrie. But nonetheless, hopefully this helped to educate you guys. If it did, then be sure to hit the like button. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. And I know I said that outro out of order, but I will catch you all later. Peace.